I had anxiety for many, many years. I grew up with a dad who was schizophrenic and bipolar and went through all sorts of different therapies. And then the only thing that really seemed to make a difference was when I started focusing on my body, because I went through this phase where I was so desperate, I was suicidal. So I did LSD. And on LSD, it showed me that my anxiety was actually this energy that was stuck around my solar plexus area, and it really had nothing to do with the thoughts of my mind. That energy would poke at the thoughts of my mind and create the thoughts of my mind. And I've come up with a theory of anxiety that it's really this sense of alarm, this old unresolved alarm from our old childhood wounds that weren't really solved by our parents or caregivers. And a lot of people just get caught up in their worries forever and never actually see that the underlying root cause of what they call anxiety is really the state of alarm that's been stored in their body. Now, that said, we can't separate the mind from the body. It's sort of an academic distinction. And it may not be that trauma is stored in the body after all. It may be that trauma is stored in the brain's representation of the body, which is really kind of the same thing. We're getting into sort of a semantic thing, but it's really the sensation in the body that we can focus on and change as the root cause of what's driving our anxious mind. So we have to find that root cause. And for me, it's in my solar plexus, like you said. For other people, it's in different parts of their body. But I train people to look at specifically when we get worried, when you start fixating on your worries and ruminating, go into your body and see if there's an area that kind of lights up, that feels like a pressure or pain or hot or cold or whatever. And that is probably the place of alarm that we have to focus on. I do think in our brains, there's kind of like a zero point 0.4 second little increment where the worries actually make us feel better because we get this hit of dopamine. And dopamine is this sort of motivational, kind of feel good chemical. It's not defined specifically like that. But when we feel we're on the right track, our brains secrete dopamine. So when we worry, when we get this vague pain in our chest, it's like, oh, what's that? That's a weird pain. Oh, I must be having a heart attack. Now, as soon as you think you're having a heart attack, your brain squirts a little bit of dopamine because you think, oh, there's the answer. I'm on the right track. But then, then you've got to deal with the fact that now you've convinced yourself you're having a heart attack.
I'm sure there's quite a few listeners. We all imagine the worst possible disaster, and our
Mhm.
mind races away. But what can you tell us about the three W's?
Well, they increase in intensity. So first the brain gives you a little warning like, "Hey, I hope this doesn't happen."
Mm.
And then it's like, "Well, if this happens, what if this happens?" And then the last one is the worst case scenario, which is like, and the reason why the worst case scenario is there is I believe the reason we worry is because worry drags us up into our heads, up into our thinking minds, when really the problem is this intense feeling of alarm that's down in our body that's probably been there since we were children. So, what worry does is it actually pulls our attention away from that horrible feeling that we had as a child of alarm and keeps us in our head, which on some level saves us from that horrible feeling of alarm that we had as children. Now, what worries have to do is they have to get more and more intense to keep us up in our heads. Because if worries became more benign or whatever, there's the risk that we're going to go back down into that feeling state of alarm again. So the reason why worries tend to get worse and worse is to keep us in our heads and away from that painful feeling of alarm that's probably been there since we were 4, 5, 7, 12 years old. But I think really the healing from just about any mental disorder comes from adult you connecting with child you. I think that's really what it comes down to. Anxiety at its fundamental is a separation of mind from body, which is why exercise and yoga and that sort of stuff helps. And it's a separation of your adult self from your child self. And both of those things, the separation of mind and body and the separation of adult self and child self, cause alarm in your system. So when you resolve the separation of your mind and your body, like doing things like yoga or meditation or chanting or whatever, and you resolve that separation of your adult self, judging your child self or not wanting to be with your child self because the child holds all the pain, then you start resolving the anxiety, the root cause of the anxiety, as opposed to just, using therapies like CBT or whatever to try and talk yourself into the fact that you don't have anxiety, or there's strategies you can use to avoid the anxiety, which there are. It's just that you're always going to be avoiding. You're never actually going to heal the underlying root cause. You're just cognitive strategies basically just help you change your reaction to the anxiety. They don't actually heal the anxiety itself. So, cured is a funny word. I think that anxiety is part of life. I think it will always be a part of my life. I think it drives me on some level, but it's just that out of control runaway train anxiety is gone now. I can recognize that I can be in it for a few minutes and go, oh, okay, I don't like this feeling, but I can actually stay with the feeling. I'm not going to run away from it, because running away from the feeling just creates more worry. We run away from the feeling typically into worry and rumination, rather than just sitting there and actually allowing that feeling to come through, the sadness of, potentially losing my mother, just staying with that feeling rather than this immediate escape into the ruminations of the mind, which is, I believe, what we did as children, because when we're powerless children and there's a situation where you're being abused, abandoned, bullied, neglected, or whatever, there is no escape. There is no escape at that particular point. So now as an adult, you realize, yes, there is. I can actually stay in my body, metabolize that old wound, metabolize that old pain, stay with it even if it hurts. And I have this thing that I write about in the book called Sensation Without Explanation, which is basically allowing the sadness, allowing the alarm, allowing the envy, allowing the negative emotion. Just be there. Just allow it to be there. Put your hand over it. Localize where you feel it in your body. Put your hand over it. Breathe into it. Stay with it. Because if you stay with it, you will metabolize it. But if you, every time you feel it, you go into your head and start to worry, you never actually stick with it long enough to metabolize it and change it in any way. I mean, my regret is that I suffered for so many years. I
Mm,
think that's the thing. Like, am I grateful for it now? Yeah. I mean, I write about this in the book too. The reason why I think I became an anxiety expert was to make sense of the pain that my father went through, to make to take his pain and actually put it into the world in a very positive way. So in that respect, yeah, it's a very fulfilling experience for me to do that. There is this sense that anxiety will always be a part of my life. I am on some level grateful for it, for sure, because it's actually pointed me to a much better relationship with myself. Just being able to find that younger version of me and see him, hear him, be open to him, understand him, love him, and defend him. That's really important. But my regret in it is it took me so long to find this, because I was kind of stuck in traditional therapies for a long time, cognitive therapies, you name the therapy, I probably did it, and medications, all that kind of stuff. And really, they're just kind of band-aids. They don't really fix the underlying cause of the problem. So my only, or my big issue with anxiety is that I stayed in it for so long, and I wish that I would have been able to heal it a lot earlier than that. But I'm not against medication. I think that whatever gets you through the night, in a lot of ways, once you start your healing process and you're on the right track, then I think medications start to fall away naturally. I think that's what happens. But we need to sort of titrate our healing, because nothing happens quickly. Your anxiety probably built in you over the course of 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 years. We're not going to heal that in a week. No matter what internet program says, here, I did this program and my anxiety was completely gone in 4 days. Like, it just, the way that the structures of your brain work just don't work that way. A lot of anxiety and alarm are mediated by structures lower down in your brain, more the unconscious structures: pons, medulla, amygdala, bed nucleus of the striatum terminalis, anterior cingulate cortex, and none of those structures understand language. They all understand feeling. So we have to change the feeling. And that takes a while before the new feeling is the new way of life. And That's why a lot of healing from anxiety, and I tell this to all the people that I work with, is kind of like this two steps forward, one step back process. Is that, I'll have people that I work with going, I had a really anxious weekend. I was feeling so good up until that. Is my therapy failing? It's like, no, your nervous system is now testing you because you know what to do now. It's testing you to make sure that you use these strategies in the time that you need them the most. So your system will test you and give you some anxiety and alarm just so that you can practice this, so that you can learn a new way of thinking, feeling, and being. The horse is out of the barn as far as
Hmm.
that goes. Like, people are not going to all of a sudden go back to not being dopamine driven, not being dopamine dependent. There's a couple of great books, The Molecule of More is one, Dopamine is another one, just about how the human brain is wired for novelty. Um, and anything that kind of stimulates it. So the horse is out of the barn as far as social media goes. I think the only way that we're going to be able to kind of pull ourselves out of this tailspin is creating community efforts of connection. It doesn't have to be a lot of connection, but I just think that making people feel that they are a part of something and that they're not separate from everyone else, because that's in if you look at since 1950s and 1960s, where you used to know all your neighbors, you used to have barbecues with them, you'd but we don't have that anymore. We next door neighbors, like, you may not know anything about them, and it's a metaphor for just how separate we are as a society. We gain security from being connected to other people, and the currency of being a human being is dropping. Just we used to give people a lot of, I guess leeway isn't the right word, but just if you're a different race than white or whatever it was, it's just like, well, you're human too. You suffer the way, maybe not the way that I do, but we all have this sort of sense of connection to each other. We're all human beings. Now it's getting to be the us them mentality that's being fostered specifically in the States, and specifically under people like Trump and that kind of stuff. Trump didn't start it, but he basically just threw a bunch of fire on this whole divisive thing, where he calls people names, and it's just, and the reason why people do that is to develop this us them mentality, because in the us mentality you feel a little more secure, but by definition there's a them. We need rules and we need certain constructs to survive as a civilization. And what we are doing is systematically dismantling those constructs. And when we do that, we lose human currency and we lose the idea that we are all connected. And that's a very dangerous place. So the solution with all that negative is to, communities, start becoming more connected to each other. But it's just developing the sense of connection with each other, and not that the other side or other people or whatever have it better than us, or they should be punished because they're this way or that way, or they're not like us. This is what's dismantling the constructs that society runs on.